Hey there. Once again, I'm picking up on last week's topic of timing. And what I want to talk about today is one way I employ timing in multi-episode workings, whose purpose is to change an ingrained pattern of behavior. Now, putting together this video wasn't terribly easy because the reality is, like most aspects of craft, one should ideally cater their spells to the specifics of their situation. And this holds just as true in the case of timing as it does most places. But because I didn't simply want to provide a long, that is, a shallow, list of possibly relevant examples of timing cues for spells, I've decided to focus on just a handful. These are, I think, widely applicable to the sorts of bad habits or negative patterns that most of us experience, including the example of social anxiety we talked about last time. I've done this so that I can go into some depth regarding why I tackle these sorts of events the way I do, as well as provide some insight regarding how I go about doing so. So in addition to talking about when I think another round of spellcraft is called for, I'm including an explanation of what sort of spellcraft I engage in at these times. In each of the cases I talk about here, the timing of various parts of the spell isn't determined ahead of time, but is triggered in response to an event, which may be a little different than what you're used to, or not. Either way, there's good reason for this, in my opinion, some of which I touched on last time. Which reminds me, for those of you who are hopping in on this discussion of timing for the first time, oh dear, you may want to check out the previous videos first, particularly the second one, or you're liable to have a bit of trouble following along. I've linked those videos below. Some of the material included may seem a bit dense at first listening, but if you feel like you're swimming a bit, I've included a quick recap of the actual steps, minus all of the psychological mumbo-jumbo at the end of the video. So first things first. The first piece of the spell, the original working, behaves the same way as the one-shot spell. It provides a big burst of capacity to change and launches you on your new path. Its purpose is, generally speaking, to overcome the initial barrier blocking you from making that change. That thing preventing you from breaking the existing succeed-fail streak, which is basically what ingrained behavior is. That's the purpose of the first spell in a multi-episode working, but what is the specific goal? It sounds like a simple question, but it's not really, because specification of a spell's goal often isn't a single act. It's frequently a cocktail that includes the creation of a goal and the comprehension of the reward you seek. Why? Because when we're talking about bad habits, like last video's example of social withdrawal after experiencing embarrassment, those things that we wished we didn't do often, and perhaps counterintuitively, come to provide a reward in and of themselves, even if you hate that you engage in this behavior at all. Reward isn't just the attainment of something you want or like, it's also the removal or destruction of things you don't like. In our example, then, the withdrawal following embarrassment may occur as a means of alleviating one's building anxiety or hurt, which is like, yeah, lady, obviously we covered this in Intro to Psych, but my point is that this social retreat is in and of itself rewarding. It feels good in the moment, and this good feeling reinforces the get embarrassed, withdraw into yourself pattern of behavior. The negative fallout, the part you hate, builds more slowly. It may grow to become the larger part of the experience, outweighing the positive, but it only does so gradually. Its power and negative impact peaks later. In the first moment or two, the bad habit is actually experienced as a big improvement over your prior situation. The process can be thought of as similar to how a catastrophic event kicks you into survival mode, where there's no room for the sense of loss, no capacity to consider the greater repercussions. All of those feelings and thoughts will come inevitably and will often grow to become far larger shadows, far more lasting and painful than the emotions experienced in the moment. But again, only later. In the face of imminent threat, one concern rises above all others: escape, and to hells with the consequences. And this, obviously, is exactly what should happen in the face of great danger. It is fundamentally a very good thing. The problem arises when it occurs in response to the benign, or in the face of minor risk. The first working, then, isn't just about calling in new behaviors or banishing old ones, but about stripping away the perceived reward you experience as a result of those unwanted behaviors, and on building up the perceived reward associated with the new desired behavioral response. That is, we want to redefine our relationship as it relates to reward with the unwanted behavioral pattern as well as with the replacement pattern. There are a lot of ways to do this, and none of them is a silver bullet, but for starters, just realizing that the behavior you hate is, at some level, something you also value deeply does, I think, help one to see one's thoughts and actions more clearly for what they are. And in recognizing this little glimmer of love you hold for that behavioral pattern, perhaps instead of berating that part of you that clings to it, you can be moved to empathize with yourself instead. Love, even the most unhealthy love, is hard to let go of, and turning away from a thing you love is always, always experienced as a loss. In working a spell to break your connection to the behavior, one which manifests as a protector who soothes you in the moment, who provides you with that fleeting sense of relief, this aspect/impulse that has become your savior, in working a spell to break your close and dependent relationship with it, you are choosing to walk away from the relief it provides. You are saying goodbye to a protector that has walked beside you for years, probably, jumping in to faithfully defend you at the first sign of embarrassment, but who does so in a way that causes at least as much damage as it prevents. And that's part of what makes it tricky, I think. This aspect isn't an enemy, not entirely, not to you. The problem is just, it's like that old saying, to a hammer everything is a nail. To this aspect, you're in constant need of rescuing from every little social stress, and it'll try to save you from them even if it means smothering you to death. When you break that relationship, you're inviting an event that necessarily brings with it a sense of loss. If you don't acknowledge this sense of loss, you'll only be tempted to flee from it, running right back into the arms of that old, comfortable savior. If instead you do face the reality that when you refuse to be saved by that aspect/impulse, you will feel a pang of loss. You'll be ready for it. I would personally then be inclined to ensure that my first working acknowledged not just the change I want, but the cost of that change. To let myself mourn the good that is being let go of along with the bad. To recognize that in time, that sense of loss, of not being able or ready to do without, will fade. To acknowledge that the temptation to run back to that old habit isn't a reflection of my true desires or personal power. These are found in my defiance in the face of that impulse. And importantly, I would seek to recognize that just as I've come to value that old maladaptive impulse too much, I haven't given resistance its due. So in that first working, I would also begin strengthening my relationship with the behavior I hope to achieve instead. Just as with the savior I'm leaving behind, I must choose to see it for what it is. See what immediate rewards it is currently failing to provide. Understand In other words, why I do not trust this other aspect as much. Why I am less willing to put myself in its hands, even knowing that rationally I should. And in so doing, try to sort out how I can begin building a bridge to this aspect. How, in understanding it, we might forge a healthy and trusting relationship so that, in time, this new alliance is even more rewarding than the unhealthy one I'm putting behind me. And then, once you've gotten the process underway and have launched your multi-episode working with a bang, be ready. Because that old bad habit, that aspect that walked next to you for so long, is going to needle you in the hopes of weaseling back into that spot by your side. Now you'll note that I'm personalizing these behavioral patterns quite a bit, treating them very much as Jungian shadows. This isn't necessary if that's not your thing, but since I like to interface with persons in Circle, to converse and interact with embodied aspects of self and other, I define behavioral patterns as such and work with them that way more and more. Anyway, your response to this old aspect's attempt to reassert itself is where timing comes in for me. Timing is how I maintain a grip on my new chosen companion and the strength to keep saying no to the old one until it becomes so second nature that I no longer feel that loss. For all that last time I discussed the concept of probabilities to some extent, in reality, the odds of slipping, of, in this case, withdrawing in embarrassment following some social awkwardness, isn't the same all the time. There are scenarios in which failure, defined here as a reversion to social withdrawal, are more likely to occur. By using timing to our advantage, we're simultaneously trying to avoid slipping as much during these higher risk times, and trying to reduce the chance that inevitable failures will result in a long string of fails. There are, of course, many, many things that sway the odds of success toward and away from your favor. And just as obviously, it's neither useful nor worthwhile to plan around 99% of them. Worrying over every nudge toward and away from one's goal, particularly when that goal is related to anxiety itself, quickly becomes counterproductive. Besides, realistically, I think you can trust your craft to give you a meaningful advantage in many such instances anyway. But there are 3 factors that I think bear particular consideration in cases like the one I'm discussing here. These are unrelated stressors, environmental context, and the first time you fail twice in a row. First off, unrelated stressors. I'd be surprised if anybody listening has not experienced the very common occurrence of slipping into negative patterns during times of stress, whether it's a result of a nasty fight with a loved one, a surprise deadline at work, or being told you're going to need root canal. The cause doesn't really matter. Regardless of the source of the stress, a whole host of behavioral patterns you thought you'd successfully released back into the wild are going to start showing up on your porch and rattling the doorknob, looking for attention and soul food. And since stress is an endemic feature of life, it's unavoidable that eventually it'll rear up and take a swing at the changes you've been more or less successfully maintaining until that point. Which makes the first major stressor, whatever form it takes, the perfect time to bolster your long-term multi-episode working with another bit of spellcraft. In some cases, this sort of stressor is foreseeable. If you're a student and it's 3 weeks till finals, then it's probably a good idea to plan your reinforcing ritual for about 2 to 2.5 weeks from now. If the stressor is a surprise, it's spellcraft time. And the sooner you can get into Circle after the arrival of the stressor, the better. Think of the stressor as a storm front. You bring the drying laundry in as soon as the thunder reaches you, because you know the wind and rain isn't far behind. You don't wait until after your sopping bra, flailing as if possessed by some rabid bird of prey, launches itself from the clothesline directly into the horrified, upturned face of your neighbor's beagle. In terms of what kind of spell is called for, frankly, I tend to think that reinforcement is the key word here. The goal of this particular episode of Craft, for me, is to prop up any of the bits of your initial working that may have been weakened as a result of the stressor. You don't need to reinvent the mystical wheel here. It's enough to make sure that the path of progress that you've chosen and have begun to walk remains clear and free of debris. So put aside some time to re-experience that first spell a bit. Revisit some of the takeaway moments of enlightenment. Handle the tools you used. Repeat the words that spoke to you most forcefully. Simply touch base with the feel of the spell and the feeling of having cast it. Environmental context is another crucial consideration, in my opinion. The ingrained pattern of behavior that is our focus and the reason for our work may be the sort of thing that occurs frequently in many contexts. Nail biting, for instance. You do it on the bus, you do it in your car, you do it watching Netflix in bed. It may emerge primarily in some specific emotional or psychological context, but from a geographic standpoint, may not be very closely tied to one place. But our example of social withdrawal likely is one that emerges overwhelmingly in the same locale over and over again. If you're in high school, then school corridors are hotspots for rubbing elbows, and so hotspots for this behavior to emerge. Your kitchen, not so much. Ditto if most of your social interaction occurs in the office and otherwise you're essentially a homebody. Now, this is a terrific reason to consciously include mental representations of those sorts of places in your initial working, by the way. And frankly, I think it's a mistake not to. But even if you do, it means that your capacity to call upon the changes you've made, your odds of succeeding when tested, are likely to be higher in those particular contexts than outside of them. Which means your social interaction without withdrawal winning streak is more likely to be broken when you run into a colleague at the grocery store, or while you're chatting with peers while standing in line at an amusement park. The reason this happens is fundamentally the same reason that habitual drug users frequently OD on their usual dosage when they use in a new place for the first time. We learn by association, and regardless of whether we're thinking about something consciously or not, our brains are keeping track of myriad cues, including contextual ones, in order to predict whether and when something is going to happen, and it actively prepares itself for what it thinks is coming. This video will get thoroughly out of hand if I go into any more depth on context here, but I should upload a video on the topic at some point because it's a great one. For now, though, what I'd like to suggest is that changes in environment often weaken the work we completed in Circle somewhat. The strongest effects of this sort of behavior-altering work will, I think, always be experienced in the contexts we associate directly through earlier experience and during the spell casting process itself with the change we are trying to elicit. Therefore, when the pull to revert to that old behavioral pattern arises for the first time in a new context, it's a great time to roll up your sleeves and bolster your craft. Here, though, my focus isn't on reinforcing that first episode of Craft, but on extending it. That is, I'll approach this spell as one designed to stretch the influence of my initial working to cover a wider physical area. Stretch it to encompass the spaces that don't immediately spring to mind as places I'm likely to run into this pattern of behavior. Finally, let's talk about the first time we fail twice in a row. I'll start by saying this is extremely likely to happen. And unlike the other examples where the timing of additional spells can be used to reduce the probability of failure before it even happens, although this isn't by any means necessary in either instance, that is expressly not what I'm trying to do here. Instead, this one is entirely about preventing a streak of failures that will lead to reduced success overall. The way I do this is by first singling out those 2-in-a-row failures as an aberration caused by something I can identify, rather than the inevitable norm. And second, by moving the goalposts for success, which means that the key word for this part of the overall spell is reassess. In general, the first episode of spellcraft I do in a multi-episode working, the one that functions as a standalone, one-off spell itself, provides enough power and momentum that for the first several tests I face thereafter, I'm very likely to succeed in whatever it was I was trying to do. In other words, I'll typically enjoy a string of successes before the spell's oomph begins to fade, which is, I think, exceedingly common. And even if and when I fail every so often thereafter, these occasional flops are ones that, generally speaking, I don't have much trouble forgiving myself for or bouncing back from. They're not, as a rule, enough to knock me off my horse. But once I hit 2 failures in a row, whether this is symptomatic of dehorsing or not, it's time for me to schedule some circle time. This portion of the spell is one I make sure is particularly self-indulgent and luscious, because really it's important to celebrate yourself and what you've learned to this point. So incorporate as many feel-good components as you can handle, along with whatever items, characteristics, what have you, that will help reduce any sense of disappointment you may be experiencing. There's to be no self-criticism or berating failures here, nor, again, judgment for having an old crutch/savior pop up, if such a thing applies, as in our embarrassment example. Rather, now is the time to gently touch base with that old behavioral aspect, with the new one sitting firmly by your side, and have a discussion or exploration of whether there was some sort of trigger that pulled the old aspect back to center stage or not. Whether those repeated failures were little more than a byproduct of that old aspect picking away at your fortitude until it could sneak back into its usual place or not. Whether something you've learned over the several successes you've enjoyed has clarified some feature of what makes that aspect tick, or can better inform what that aspect has to offer that your new desired behavioral pattern doesn't. This mystical mental roundtable is yet another opportunity to work through some of the remaining emotions that may have emerged since you last tried to break your close ties to that old aspect, and importantly, to celebrate the budding new relationship you've forged with a new behavioral pattern and the outcomes and benefits you've enjoyed as a result. This last bit is crucial to my particular approach, because in identifying those perks, I can start to build a clear idea of what rewards are tied to this new aspect that the first one lacked, and make a conscious effort not to take those positive qualities for granted or write them off as flukes. In being able to recognize them when they appear, I can better seize the moment of enjoyment when they arise, and so reinforce my desire to do whatever, to not withdraw. And I will make it a point to revel in the moment, the feeling of engaging in the new behavior I'm trying to form consciously, first in circle, and then every time it occurs outside of it. And I'll absolutely use spellcraft to ensure that I do my best to appreciate that feeling every time I experience it. Becoming consciously aware of these positive aspects of the behavior, the positive feelings associated with engaging in the new behavior, is the key purpose of this portion of the spell. This is how I move the goalposts of success. Because as that enjoyment of the new pattern of behavior gets stronger and stronger, the goal ceases to be don't withdraw, but becomes do that thing that makes you feel like this. In other words, the spell is complete when the goal transforms from the avoidance of a behavior to the active pursuit of an experience. Whew. Okay, so your head may well be swimming a bit because I just dumped a ton of information, or it seems that way to me. There's a decent chance that you're thinking that this all sounds like a hell of a conceptual juggling act. More like an instruction manual for deconstructing an engine than putting together a spell, even if it is multi-episode. But I swear to you, that's an illusion. Because the complicated bit, the wordy bit, is the explanation, the rationale for why this is my preferred means of going about things. The processes themselves, the things I actually do, are simple and feel very natural. And like a lot of craft, it's just as likely to work, even if once you've listened to this, you just follow the much, much shorter list of spellcrafting to-dos I'm about to provide and never think about the details again. In other words, the details are there to illuminate the way I think about things. And as a potential source of inspiration or insight for you, should you start wandering down these sorts of paths. They're not necessary to actually apply this technique to your work. So here it goes. To recap the actual instructions, Step 1 is to construct a one-off spell that will launch you in the right direction. When considering the goal, take note of what it is about the thing you're trying to change that you find rewarding. Acknowledge that breaking this behavioral pattern means parting ways with something that at some level you care about, possibly love. Recognize that the new behavioral pattern you're hoping to instill in yourself can probably provide you with rewards that you haven't thus far thought about or appreciated, and which can, in time, more than make up for the loss of the old bad habit. Steps 2, 3, and 4 may occur in any order, but they are 2. Combat unexpected stressors by reinforcing your spell work. 3. Prevent or repair a loss of momentum caused by facing a challenge in an unexpected context by extending your spell beyond its original geographic or situational reach, as it was defined in your original spell, which has probably, either consciously or unconsciously, been associated primarily with the places where you're most likely to face the issue you're working on. 4. Recover from 2 failures in a row by reassessing your relationship with both your old behavioral pattern and the new one taking its place. Finally, move the goalposts of success both during that 2 failure spell and thereafter by first identifying, then building upon the positive feelings you've begun to associate with the new behavioral pattern. Do this until your goal has naturally transformed into a desire to chase that feeling, rather than a desire to avoid the old behavior. That's it. You're done. Or rather, I'm done. Everybody is done. So thank you for stopping by. I hope you get some use out of this. And until next time, a lovely night to you all.